Hello. Hey, everybody. Hi. Welcome back from a nice lunch. We are now into our third panel of the day, globalizing the history of the world wars. We've covered home fronts with many questions that remain. We've covered imperial spaces with lots of problematics included. And now we're on to the simple subject of memory. We are tackling global memories of the wars. And I'd first like to thank our terrific conference organizers, Bruno Cabanes and Cameron Gibbons, one more time, for all of their effort. Okay, so I will do a brief introduction of our speakers and then launch us into a conversation. We're using this mic here, so hopefully you all can hear us a little bit better. And if you have any questions or comments out there, let us know. The format here is very similar. This is a conversation, not pre-scripted papers. We're going to start with a provocative question, hoping to get something like 2 to 3 minute responses, just like the other fantastic panelists have modeled, not going on too long. And you all are welcome to get ready to ask questions at any point, throw them in the chat, but especially once we open this up for Q&A. And then one final thing to keep in mind is that we're trying to conclude this panel by thinking globally about everything that we've come through today. So at the end of our Q&A in this conversation, we're going to try to make some points of synthesis across and really think together about the stakes of globalizing the history of the world wars. So first off, Annette Becker, who you've already met today, professor of contemporary history at Paris West-Nanterre. She's written extensively on the two world wars, extreme violence that they nurture, with an emphasis on military occupations, 2 genocides, against the Armenians and the Holocaust, as we've heard a bit about before already today. She's devoted much of her research to humanitarian politics, to trauma, and to memory, and memory is what we'll be reflecting on most now. Next up, joining us remotely is Professor Santanu Das, professor of modern literature and culture at the University of Oxford, a very eminent scholar, lots of things that I could cite, but we're trying to have a conversation, so I won't go on and on with too long of an introduction, but simply to say, has written path-breaking works such as Colonial Encounters in a Time of Global Conflict, that's an edited volume, India, Empire, and the First World War, First World War Literature, Culture, Modernity, and Indian Troops in Europe. Then on top of that, we've got 2 more fantastic panelists here with us in person. We've got J.P. Newman, who's associate professor in 20th century European history at Maynooth University. He's interested in modern history of the Balkans and East Central Europe, with particular focus on Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Czechoslovakia. Has written a really important book on Yugoslavia in the shadow of war, veterans and the limits of state building, 1903 to 1945. And one of his comments earlier was about state building. I hope we can get into state building and memory, which is an interesting area, I think, for us to contemplate collectively. I won't continue belaboring introductions, but finally, we've got Ran Zwigenberg, who I had the pleasure of sitting next to last night and chatting with about how amazing New York City is, though he's at Penn State, but educated largely in New York. He's written a really amazing book on Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory Culture from Cambridge a few years ago. We talked about this in our planning meetings. How can we think about Hiroshima and memory? And it deals comparatively with the commemoration and the reaction to the Holocaust and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and is published on issues of war memory, atomic energy, survivor politics, and more. I could go on, but we want to have a conversation here. So my idea, and we prescripted this part slightly, was to start with a provocative kind of comment generated by a question, something like, what major topic or approach do you think has added to our understanding of the memory of the war or wars in question today? World War I, World War II, or both? So what major topic or approach has added to our understanding of the memory of war? And in some ways, when we were doing our planning conversations, maybe has added to, enhanced, or detracted from a revolution in the study of memory of war? So what major topic or approach has both impacted that and perhaps led to a revolution in the study of war, if you want to call it that. So I'll just hand this off to my left, and we'll go through this, and Santanu will culminate us with something brilliant, I'm sure, remotely.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And thank you, Bruno and Cam, for your hospitality and for your invitation. I'm sort of running still on adrenaline and caffeine. I'm hoping that that will last, at least for the duration of this panel. So I guess I'll give two answers to this question, and I'll be very brief. And the first is a positive response to something I think that's happening in my field. That is helping to change the discourse, and then maybe one that is missing, but not just from my field, but more generally, perhaps, is something that we can all work on in the global history of the two world wars. So in the study of Central and Eastern Europe in the First World War and its aftermath, in the last kind of 15 or 20 years, we've really made a lot of strides in sort of social and cultural history. And there's been a good, I think, exchange and interaction between people, the work of people like Bruno and Jay Winter and John Horn and Annette Becker and many of these people. And a lot of historians working in this field have fruitfully adapted or modified those ideas. Particularly, I would say, gender history and this topic. This is something that arrived very early on in the history of the social and cultural history of the war in Central and Eastern Europe, at least in Anglophone writing. There are some excellent historians working in this field. And this is not something I think that's lacking. This is really something where other people working in other fields can sort of look into this, read, and really learn a lot from the work that's been done. So I would say gender history, gender and war. I'm not saying that it's perfect, and I'm not saying the job is done and we can move on, because of course that's not how these things work, but it's going very well. And just one example pulled out of thin air would be Mo Healy's book. It's not really gender history, it's actually women's history. She writes about Vienna at the end of the First World War, comes back to what we were talking about earlier, the home front. This is simply a classic of war history, of war studies. The field that I think maybe we've got a bit of a deficit in the study of war and its aftermath is a topic that's come up a couple of times already in the panels earlier, and that is generational history. There are some books, and some excellent books. There's a book by a historian called Marcy Shaw at Yale University that looks at Polish Warsaw intellectuals in the interwar period, kind of a collective biography. But she does deal, and in other parts of her work as well, with generational history. But it's really not something, I don't think, that we've systematically, comprehensively inquired into and thought about. And that might be more generally true of war studies and war history and the two world wars. So if we compare, for example, the discussions we've been having today and in the field more generally about things like chronology, and we all know the work of John Horn and Robert Gebhardt and the Greater War and this kind of thing, we've really thought again and again about different periodizations and where the war ends and when the war begins. We've thought about concepts of temporality, people like Natasha Wheatley, and of course Christopher Clark's book, a new book on Germany, looks at the way time is conceived and experienced. So there's really been excellent work on chronology, periodization, and temporality, but I don't see the same kind of granular study into generational history. So I really feel like and forgive me if this is a naive point and I'm sort of neglecting anybody's work, but it feels like we haven't sat down and thought in those terms. What is a generation? What are the experiential points that create a generational group? What's the size of a generation? How does it generate? What is the reproduction and what is the size of these groups? How do they transmit ideas? What is the post memory? How do memories of the war transmit from one generation to the next? That seems to be something that's really critical in the study of war. We heard that earlier in our panel earlier. So those would be my 2 points. Gender history in good shape, and I think more work needs to be done, but it heading in a good direction. Generational history, a lot of work still to be done, but potentially a very fruitful area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would have also 2 points very, very quickly. I think what had been forgotten for a long time is forgetfulness and oblivion. And I think it comes from the beginning of the studies on memory in the 20s by Maurice Halbachs, because he didn't think at all that he was very keen on intergenerational, actually, but he didn't understand at all that not everything is memory. There is as much oblivion as there is memory. And I think we are still not there. We are still not there. There have been huge work on trauma, but mainly on trauma revealing some memory, and not so much about trauma revealing the oblivion of the war time. And I would say it's true for the two world wars, absolutely, and probably for other violent issues that we could speak about. And the second thing, where I think we are getting there, and by speaking about gender and generational, you are doing that, GP, it is the individual and the collective. I think for a long time, it is mainly the collective memory which has been studied, like mass movement, and perhaps against it is Halbachs. Even without knowing Halbachs, we were like doing prose we were doing prose. But we thought instinctively that we were part of all kind of groups, and it was as groups that we had to be studied in memory. But the new studies going to individuals, not collective bereavement, but individual bereavement. You are this human being, you are a woman, you are a man, you are a child, you are somebody who very old who lost children in the war. You got into this specific awful tragedy, which is a rape or the death of a dear one. And this is you as an individual. And obviously, as historians, we are not psychoanalysts, and we are not doing to study everybody at this depth. But I think that to put together personal experience of very normal individuals, which are all specifics and all normal, will give a lot about the memory and the oblivion of war. And I think there is a lot of work to begin to be in this direction, but there is still a lot to do in this direction.
Thank you, and thank you both for really good comments that kind of threw me off track because they kind of covered what I wanted to say. Maybe I'll start with the psychoanalysis. Is something I just finished a book on trauma in Hiroshima, and there was a tendency in trauma studies to use psychoanalysis pretty heavily, which I'm not happy about, because groups are not individuals, and groups don't go through the same mechanism of trauma an individual does. So I think you're right. We need to be very specific as historians of who we're writing on. But just to go to my prepared comment, I think when I'm thinking about the question before, I thought about and also thinking about what was said before. I was thinking about what Shamoy said about going below and above the nation. I think that's the words you use, and this is something you see a lot in Japanese work on memory right now, and work on regional memory. Work in Hiroshima, like most of it is in Japanese, but work like Imoto Masao in Hiroshima, and in English Modo Hiroko on Aizu, which is not quite about war, but it look at regions as units rather than going the nation, and it's something that Sebastian Conrad even already in 2002 or 2003 already wrote about the tunnel vision of the nation, and how memory studies are always fixated on national communities, but this is not how it works. And in my work on global memory, you see how you have regions, cities, communities, groups. We talked about labor before, right? Labor groups have their own socialist labor memory, labor culture that is international. And you know a lot about socialist memory, of course, is very different from the trajectories we think about in the West. And in this, there's something, maybe just a last comment before we move on. The globalization kind of memory also shows that there's hierarchies of memory, because there's a reason why we forget those other memories, for example, socialist memories, because there's hierarchies in this globalization, like any other globalization. If you talk about global memory culture, whose voices count, and we talked already about colonial voices and others, who gets to speak. And in terms of Hiroshima, I work with people who work on survivors of nuclear tests in Pacific. They're also survivors of nuclear war in a way, but their voices do not sound as much as Japanese survivors, and that's question a lot of them resources. I mean, who gets the money to buy memorial, to build memorials, right? And to have video archives like we have. And of course, then the Holocaust is the big shadow behind it. I mean, there's a hierarchy. Is the Holocaust hovering above everything else? Which it is, but we can take a quarter. So, yeah.
So, Santanu?
Thanks. Firstly, kind of huge thanks to Bruno and Cam, and then to Chris for sharing the session. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I'd just like to start with just one comment. I think that memories are remarkably intimate. They're messy and shape-shifting, and they're also historically very specific. For example, there is nothing like Indian memory of the First World War. You know, there's memories of some sepoys and laborers. They're very, very different. So I think there is an inherent tension between these very rooted individual memories and this concept of global memory, whatever that may mean. I was very struck by what, you know, kind of my co-panelists said about oblivion. And the point I would like to make is that I think that memory is also a structure of feeling and experience. And it is this experiential dimension of memory I've been very interested in. And I'll just read out one sentence. This is from 1931, Benjamin, from the Arcades Project. He's talking about the process of remembering, and I quote, "The cautious probing of the spade in the dark loam, and it is to cheat oneself of the richest prize, to preserve as a record merely the inventory of one's discovery, and not this dark joy of the place of finding itself." And I think it is this process of finding itself we have been interested now for some time. And in the context of the First World War, to pick the most difficult examples, African memories of the First World War, I think the works of kind of different works from Michel Moyd's work on violent intermediaries to something like very different in genre, William Kentridge's kind of wonderful opera, The Head and the Load. I think they have been quite path-breaking examples. I think we need to look beyond academia and think about other creative processes. So that's my first point. And I think we could make this leap because of the advances in both feminist scholarship, which showed us the way in 1980s, as well as cultural history. And again, the work of kind of Jay Winter kind of has been quite fundamental. And I think in these works, both feminist history and cultural, kind of this cultural turn, there is not just interdisciplinarity, but a certain intellectual promiscuity. And I think this promiscuity is very important when we are thinking about something as messy as memory. And more recently, and this is my final point, I think what has completely transformed the nature of memory or memory studies, as particularly during the centennial years, is the digital revolution. It's completely visual now. We are now thinking through technology, and I think it will take us much more time to absorb what these images do to our understanding. And I think in that sense, kind of Peter Jackson's film, though it's quite slick and facile, it's quite an interesting example about how, you know, when we see color, kind of digitized images of something we know, what does that do to our structures of memory? I'll stop there now.
Thanks. That was excellent. Just to synthesize where we landed, there's really some vibrant interdisciplinary conversations going on about an affective turn of a variety of forms, right? That structure of feeling comment that Santanu put out there. It strikes me that memory making is fundamentally affective in some very important ways, and ways that can transcend generations through different archival sorts of orientations, like through images, or Peter Jackson then choosing to add color, right, and make more legible in a 21st century sense the actors of the 20th century or other eras. So, one of the questions and directions we were hoping to go here was to talk a little bit about memory making, this messy project. I think Annette also points us to the memory forgetting or memory holding of things like trauma, and then both rediscovery and other forms of interrogation of those memories. And so the sort of one question that comes from our previous panels would be to ask, is there a fundamental difference in memory making in sort of more Western context or European context and colonial contexts? Is there a difference in the memory making about those places? Who does that work? We've sort of touched on this in different ways in this panel already. I'll leave it at that. Deceptively simple question.
Would you like to go down the line? Yeah, I guess I'm probably not the best person to start with that question because people know the colonial context much better than me. So maybe if I pass it, Santanu.
Want to start us off? Yes.
Well, I think there is a difference not just between the West and the colonies, but across the colonies. Huge differences, absolutely huge. I think Saidia Hartman says that to enter the colonial archive is to enter a mortuary. Because many of these people, it's not just Eurocentrism. I think the majority of the colonial actors had been non-literate. So how do we recover the memories of people who didn't know how to read and write? Second, I think in many of these kind of former colonies, monetary compensation took the place of commemoration. When they returned, they wanted land and money rather than, so there is no culture of commemoration. For example, there is nothing like the Imperial War Museum or the Australian kind of war memorial. Whether it's in India or Pakistan, Michelle would know more about Africa. So I think there is no centralized hub. But the one thing I would say, amnesia does not mean absence. At a subterranean level, there are suppressed memories, strong memories. And I was very struck by a comment that Sue Grazel made in the previous panel when she was talking about objects. And I think we need to look beyond the text into images, objects, songs, gossip, rumor, and to go back to a point that Michelle said, how to read them along, across, beyond the grain.
Just a very quick point, because it's not at all my specialty, but I totally agree with the objects, with what you just said. I think it's really extremely important in all cultures. And the little I know about Africa is Rwanda, that I know very well. And obviously, in collections of things which are not related to war at all, I don't speak about the genocide, but speak about the First World War. Suddenly you find an object which is from this time. And I think it's fascinating because the object has been kept in collections, not thinking it was about the war, but because the object was just there. And when you go back, with Rwandese, it was suddenly they said, oh, that's true, we were in First World War. And I think this, when the link is lost, because it can be lost for generation, and for Rwanda, I mean, after 94, obviously, something has been really severely cut by the genocide of the Tutsi. At some point, the objects are the only one to stay. And I think what you said is really fundamental. And that's perhaps why I became a museum person, because it is where you find this place, this object.
Okay, I'll be very quick, and these comments may be a little bit naive, but I'll put them out there anyway. And they're simply to affirm that the importance of looking at a range of sources and rethinking objects is extremely important. It occurs to me that here we have a good case for decolonizing these collections, because if it comes back to the initial question about the difference between Western memory and colonial memory, most of our interactions in the West with these objects are in museums, and this is a sort of desacralized Western hierarchical scientific gaze, which in fact is not in many cases. I mean, these are very often sacred objects that we're looking at, objects that in their original context would have been would have had a very different engagement. So it might be here there's an argument for another argument for decolonizing these collections, but certainly I think we need to be more imaginative in the way we think about sources generally, but certainly the way we think about objects as historical sources.
Yeah, I can't really speak about the colonies. I can speak about Japan. So there's a model, the Western Museum and Western memorialization, either of World War I or in later generation, the Holocaust, as the model for how do you commemorate. And you definitely see those quasi-colonial relationship between how do you do it right in the West. So if you look at places like Nanking Memorial in China, it was opened in 1985. It's very important. It's opened very, very late, right? Or even the way that they redid the Hiroshima Museum in 2014-15, there's definitely a relationship to the Holocaust and how to commemorate the Holocaust. And this is considered to be the effective and affective right way to do this. And about objects, at least in the Hiroshima case, there's dual. On one hand, once there are museums serve as repositories, as I say in English, right? Repositories for the community to bring objects that were exposed to the bomb and belong to particular people, and they have very, very strong, effective, and almost religious-like importance for the community. On the other hand, they are in museums, so they go through the museum process, and they are getting measured and preserved, and they go through this, and it's also giving them another kind of aura. So they have the same kind of object, both the Western scientific and kind of, well, I don't know if it's Japanese, but it's kind of a relic, kind of almost a sacredness to them. I don't know if it's particularly Japanese, but there's a sacredness to them at the same time.
That was excellent. So one of the things we were hoping to get to was memorialization, and we've already hit on that in several different ways, and the intersection with the archive. And one of the more open-ended questions we were thinking about in planning was, to what extent do you think there are unexploited areas in the archives to study the making of memory at a global level, as well as the multiple registers that we've been talking about here, local, regional, urban, rural, a wide divide. Several panels have been talking about this today. So just curious to know, how about we send it to you, Santanu, to start us off?
Can I just think for a moment while the others speak?
I can start.
Ron is ready to go.
Because I just have a project that I'm actually amazed that with a friend from Susanne de Zwigenberg from University of Vienna, that we're kind of amazed that no one worked on the circulation of, again, objects between museums in a post-war. And how do you we work on Holocaust objects, but you can think about all sorts of other war objects, let's say World War I. How do they get around the world? Who gets them? We actually work on human remains, which is even more of a fraught subject, circulation of ashes and human remains. And we also work with people who work on South America and circulation of Inca mummies and human and skulls and stuff like this. So it also feeds into circulation of colonial bodies. There's very layered history. There is a lot to be explored about the circulation of objects and remains, and the making of museums all over the world that needs to be traced and need to be examined, I guess.
Yes, actually, there was huge circulation very early on during the First World War, and it was mainly one people, I'm sorry, Bruce is not there anymore, we did it extremely deeply. It's the Australians and the New Zealander at a smaller scale. And why they did that? Because they crossed half the globe to fight, and they wanted the home front or the dear one their dear ones in a very intimate way, to know what was the earth, what were the rocks, what were the billboards in the trenches. And the billboards in the French trenches have been all destroyed. You cannot find a single one. If you want to see what was a real billboard, you have to go to Australia. And in a second measure, there is a few in the United States, and there is some at Kansas City Museum, but very little. In Australia, it's all over the place. And I think it's very, it took the idea that the nature where you are, the countryside where you are fighting is so different. You want to take it back to yours. So they will have nearly material feeling of what it was to be at war. And so the globalization through this, I think, has not been studied enough, and I think it's very important. And for the Holocaust, obviously, Ran knows better than me, but having been doing a lot of work all around the world about the Holocaust museums, it's obvious that you have the kind of icons that you have to have. So they are all rushing to Auschwitz to have the suitcases or the shoes. If you have the memory of Holocaust without a railway, without the suitcases, without the shoes, you don't have the right memory of the Holocaust. But it is totally crazy, because we know that much more people died in the Holocaust in the ghettos and in the mass shooting in the Eastern Europe. And they did not have suitcases, they did not have railways, they did not have this kind of mass shoes or mass haircut. So the iconic objects betray part of the memory, and have a memory which is mainstream memory, which has nothing to do with the real experience of the people. So we have to be careful also of the objects. We have to know them at the value they have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking now, I had a different answer in mind, but as I'm listening to Annette, I'm thinking this is absolutely true. We have to decode those symbols, don't we? And as you were talking, I was thinking about the previous tendency to think about the narratives of futility in British war memoirs and you know, the poets and this kind of thing. How symbols of those guys kind of, you know, memories of the war coalesced around these symbols, but in fact they were quite deceptive. But I mean, I was going to draw on something that Ran mentioned earlier in answer to the question, and that is, I think, in my area at least, which is the successor states of the First World War, so Central and Eastern European states, but actually I would include Ireland as a post-imperial successor state. I think what's underexploited and what's missing in the memory and the narratives is exactly what Ran said earlier, going above and below the nation. This is the way to sort of resolve the problems, because the memory politics and the memory cultures exist primarily at a national level in the public sphere. There are some, you know, there are some sort of caveats to this, and say historian called Maria Becker has written a great book on Romania and has talked about how the local memory was very different. But in answer to also to Annette's point about oblivion and memory, in the successor states, the regional imperial memory is the one that is going to oblivion, the one that is lost, and the national memories are the ones that are foregrounded. One example I can give you very quickly is that of Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic. After 1918, it became an independent nation state, at least in name. The memory culture of the First World War was almost completely based around the legionaries. In fact, a small group, less than 10% of combat veterans who had been recruited to fight for the Entente. It's a tiny sliver of a much more complicated spectrum of experience, but the largest part of it disappeared into, as Annette said earlier, oblivion. I think the only solution to this, to come back to what Ran said, is to go above and below the nation, to think regionally about memory palimpsests and memory tectonic plates, to think about these, to think about the imperial experience, to think about these not just this sort of always existing teleologically overdetermined nation states, but as parts of larger political bodies. There is actually a pretty good book, isn't there, by Diana Mishkova and Balázs Trencsényi, a collection of essays which talk about these, how we can conceptualize regions in Central and Eastern Europe, and maybe that offers a glimpse of a way through this impasse.
Just 1 second. So above and beyond, I didn't say that, it was Michelle, so I don't want to be, I don't want to take all the glory. But I mean, what is, I think the hierarchy is, again, to go back to what I just said, I mean, I really like what Annette was saying about this Holocaust set. There's also a Schindler, like you go to Nanking and they have the Schindler, he's a Nazi, but he literally is, but they have the Schindler. I mean, I think the only way to destabilize those set is against to go above and beyond, not of the nation, above go with symbols, and to go to other groups of other groups, other places, other individuals, even. Yeah, so done.
Thanks. No, this is very interesting, because I think I completely agree with Annette that the more familiar objects of memory often obscure our gaze from other kinds. And in the context of the First World War, I think one kind of global repository of memory would be the amazing sound archives in the Humboldt collection in Berlin, which has sound recordings of, Senegalese and Indians and Tartars and the English, the Welsh. So it's a very specific example. But I think it's also very important to know what questions to ask of the objects we have, because I think often objects speak in multiple voices. And whether they're national or local or whatever are often assumptions we bring with ourselves. And I think increasingly, and I think the other thing I should also say that my background is not at all history, it's English literature. So what I specialize in is close reading. And I think often archival hesitation brings rich rewards rather than to construct objects into a narrative. If we focus on objects and turn them round and round in our mind to see what are the different significances, there are often new intensities of meaning. So both the above and the below, I think, can be achieved. Also, if we have, like as in an exhibition, different objects, they often argue amongst themselves and tell different stories. And we get into contested histories like that. So I think kind of images, sound recordings, but also the way we interrogate objects, not as embellishments, kind of going back to a point that Michelle made of photographs, but to closely analyze them.
That's a superb point. Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, I think just sort of synthesizing that slightly in another direction that we're hoping to go with this conversation, it gets at the aftermath of war, a whole area of scholarship, and in particular, questions of cultures of victory, cultures of defeat, and how those kinds of interpretive valences then shape understandings of memory itself, right? And I think Annette's point is very profound, and Ron's as well. Going to the Hiroshima Memorial, I remember how it was tear-jerkingly affective, and yet also very much coercive in how it manipulated a kind of received wisdom of this moment. And they do it incredibly effectively with personal stories, with objects, with shadows seared into stone. I mean, it's so moving, and yet it's also generating a very singular march through the place towards the ends that they would like. And as an Americanist, as a historian of U.S. foreign policy, they do an amazing job with the targeting documents to make clear that civilians were intended to die, right? And they push that point very hard and very effectively and correctly in the archival record. So, the sort of the 30,000 foot view that we hope to get to is to give some specific examples of the aftermath of war from your work in thinking about perhaps cultures of victory, perhaps cultures of defeat, but more in terms of these larger received wisdoms or new interpretive ways of thinking about problematizing perhaps those. So I see Ron is ready to go. You jump in.
Yeah, maybe not quite culture effective fit, but in Hiroshima, they're moving you away into a very specific point they want to go, and very effectively. They also use a lot of private stories, individual stories, actually use individual stories in a way, which is very, it's very good to talk about individuals, not about nations, but in a way, it's also mask a lot of other things, because the effective power of individual stories, the tear-jerkiness, it actually takes away from the bigger context that Hiroshima was Japanese city, and Japan did really bad things in the continent. And there is a panel in the beginning about the Nanking massacre and the fact that Hiroshima was a military city, but there's a little panel that you very easily missed. So all of those museums, of course, they tell a story that leads you a certain way away from the stories that are less savory, let's say, less talked about. And it's been a topic of a lot of debate in Hiroshima in the 90s, actually, about how much do you want to talk about Japan as being a victimizer rather than being a victim. So I didn't quite answer the question.
Great response.
The first time I went to Hiroshima, which was 35 years ago, the museum was only victimizer. About victims. And when I went out of the museum, I was very angry at Japanese. Then I came back, I went back, and I even did work with the director who changed the exhibit in 2000. And the difference is amazing. The difference is amazing. And the difference is amazing because what we were saying before, because they brought the real Japanese into the story, not the nation not being at war. It was like in the first version, it was just, there was no war around. It's just the crazy pilot would suddenly put a bomb. You didn't know why and where. But now there are kids who were at war, because on the home front with their uniform, they were at war. And this kid had been killed. And the grandchildren now bring back these clothes. And the clothes are shown exactly like in Warsaw, Holocaust Museum, where the first exhibit, even before the museum really opened, the title of the exhibit was Biography of Things. And just the idea of a biography of things, it was, little things which belonged to Jews from Warsaw who had been killed in the Holocaust. But it was a biography. It is what we historians are working about. We are trying to understand how human beings in the past did live, did die, did suffer. And this is something that you can do with archives and objects and context. But I just finished on that. And Sue is the one who is a specialist here. There is something you never find in museum, or perhaps a word. But how do you show it? How do you show the rapes and the interpersonal violence, and especially the rapes, the sexual assault, which has been taking place in every war all the time, not only in the 20th century. And this, we are very short in front of it. And for me, it is one of our defeats.
Yeah, so I visited Georgia this summer, hiking through the South Caucasus, as people who follow me on social media will know. And a couple of things. First is that I visited Gori, which is the birthplace of Stalin, of course, and there is still a massive Stalin museum, which is a real house of horrors. Hasn't changed, I don't think, that much since its original presentation exhibition as a homily to the Vojt, to the great man himself. So you walk around this massive kind of mastodonic Stalinist building, and you just see image after image of him And then you see all this kind of obsequious gifts that he was sent for his 70th birthday from Korea and from Czechoslovakia and from Poland and all these kind of things. And then there's a tiny little part at the bottom where they sort of give a little bit of acknowledgement to the Gulag and to the horror. It seems like a wasted opportunity to me. This could be an excellent exhibition to the history of Stalinism. We could get a proper memory site. The other thing about Georgia is the following thing, and this is really a very obvious point that I'm going to make, but one that occurred to me when I was there. The current memory culture, of course, very anti-Russian for sort of obvious reasons, and that's been intensified this year for also very obvious reasons. Ukrainian flags everywhere, and a great sense that what's happening in Ukraine, the Georgians have a special kind of access to understanding what is happening there. The other thing is that this, in the Russian Civil War, a very complicated and many-fronted conflict, of course. Briefly in Georgia, there was a kind of an independent state that was run by socialists, strike Mensheviks, and it existed from, I think, 1918 until 1921. I could be getting the dates wrong here. And then eventually it was subsumed by the Bolsheviks, and Georgia, of course, was incorporated, just as it had been in the Russian Empire, back into the Soviet Union. But anyway, this brief period of quasi-independence and national government is now the central peg of contemporary memory culture in Georgia. This is this short-lived historic example of national independence, is the avatar, the sort of the prototype for what's happening in Georgia now. So I guess the very obvious point that I'm trying to make in a rather convoluted way, and it comes back to the question that you asked at the outset about cultures of victory, cultures of defeat, chronologies of war, when it ends, when it begins. And this, I think, is something that I'm speaking specifically now about Central and Eastern Europe, but I think it's valid elsewhere. We're really not just talking about the First World War. We're talking about many conflicts, and many of these conflicts, particularly the ones that came at the end, the ones that the Churchill disparagingly called the battles of the pygmies. These are the most consequential moments in forging memory and forging sort of national identity. Poland is an obvious example. Its history during the First World War is very complex, and it's not material that's easily lent towards building a national memory culture. I mean, they're fighting on all sides, they're fighting against one another, the Poles are. It's very difficult to trace a kind of national narrative through that. But the conflict afterwards, first of all, against the Ukrainians, of course, but even more so against the Soviets, is a much more obvious story. And one that features much more, I think becomes much more prominent. So maybe that's, again, a relatively obvious point, but I guess what I'm trying to say there is that these post-war conflicts, that's something I think that we've realized from this great, I think that's your next question about the centennials. So maybe I'm preempting the answer to this next question. That's something that I think we learned in my field, is that actually it is often the First World War in countries like Serbia, for example, very clearly it is, but it's also what happens afterwards. Those are extremely important, or often the most important conflicts.
Santanu?
Thanks, Chris. Going back to your original question of cultures of victory and defeat, I think it's a very relative concept, because if colonialism is a kind of constant violence or war, then I think the whole idea of what is victory and what is defeat, that get quite, kind of blurred. For example, in the Second World War, the big question was India fighting for kind of liberty for the Allied or from the Allied? So that raises all sorts of questions. The second thing, after the kind of First World War, I think the moment it at least it concluded in the West, people as diverse as Marcus Garvey, Liang Qichao from China, Said Zangrul from Egypt, they're all writing to Woodrow Wilson saying a greater war has begun, for racial equality. So, and there was a tremendous sense of hope. It's exactly the opposite of, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. They're filled with the sense that this is the beginning of a new world, though all these people have died. So I think it's quite a relative context. And secondly, one thing one argument I'd make for literature actually is that immediately after the war, there is an amazing Bangladeshi poet whose imagination, for example, the October Revolution, the First World War, the local kind of colonial kind of battles on the western kind of frontier of India, they all kind of bleed into each other. So now we think of these different violences kind of bleeding, but he's writing in 1923. And I think this is something literature, the singularity of literature can do, where different conflicts get fused and confused.
That's very insightful. And I think I really appreciate your pointing that out about optimism and hope in the 20s and 30s. In my own work, I find that all the time in American internationalists. The first two American women to win the Nobel Peace Prize are Jane Addams and Emily Balch in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It always strikes me that the interwar years are not at all well understood using that nomenclature. And if we could jettison it, we'd all be better off. Because so many people, particularly in the 20s, international organizations and other folks were really struggling to create a better world out of this aftermath. It's precisely the recognition of that pessimism, whether you find it located in literature, and we find lots of examples, we find it located in law, we find lots of examples, we could go through a lot of source bases there. And so, I hope we can push back against some of that. It's all doom and gloom. I just read a manuscript that someone said that we should just think about the 20s and 30s as all the destruction and chaos. So if I can say I rejected that. Yeah.
Not in the room.
Well, we have enough pessimism in the world we live in today, right? And plenty actually in the 20s and 30s. But one of the things we talked a lot about today is transitions between war and peace and periodization, and trying to do what all of the literature now today does is really encourage us to move beyond any facile understanding of quote unquote wartime. We heard about a little bit about state of exception and how that's been operationalized in different contexts, including in and out of empires and colonial spaces. In the US context, right, the US has been more or less in a state of war since World War II. And Mary Dujak would argue the US has basically always been in a state of war, with a few brief moments when the state of war wasn't being operationalized against marginalized people in the US, right? So states of war operate in very functional kinds of ways, particularly in hierarchical ways. And so as we're thinking about transitions between war and peace, memory is something that maybe provides some different kinds of insights. So I'm curious to know what you all think. If we think about globalizing the memory of both wars, what are we doing there in terms of a transition between war and peace? It seems like almost a consensus today is we're better to understand virtually all of this history as conflictual. What does memory add or not? I see an audience comments. Yes.
Are we at the audience point yet?
Let's. Oh, okay. All right. We will call on you first. How's that sound? All right. Yeah. First up. Yeah. Anyone want to lead us off on this?
I'll try. I've got a feeling Rand has more sort of cogent points than I do. Actually, on this point of pessimism and optimism, there's Santanu, and you've just mentioned that. I was just thinking, the first president of independent Czechoslovakia in the 1920s and the 1930s, Thomas Masaryk. He has a very nice line about how the post-war period, the post-war milieu in Eastern and Central Europe, at least, is a laboratory on top of a vast graveyard. So he's kind of combining both of these, actually synthesizing the destruction and the loss and acknowledging it, but also saying there's now opportunity for constructivist, future-oriented building a new world. So it's interesting. But anyway, the follow-on point is the following one that I think, and this is kind of responding to Santanu's point, but it's just an intuitive one anyway. Is that we're really, it is conflictual. These years mean vastly different things depending on which part of it. So the question is, how do we make a global memory, and how do we think about these milestones and the end of the war and transition to war and peace as a moment of global memory? We're dealing with disparate conflictual experiences. It's a very banal point. but at the same time, I think it's a true one, not just that there are shades of understanding what happened, and some people feel more strongly that this was a good moment or a bad moment, but in fact, it's completely different depending on which perspective you look from, whether it's the colonial one, the Western one. It's going to be completely different, even within armies, depending on whether you're a subaltern, whether you're an officer, or whether you're a soldier, whether you were in Russia and you experienced the October Revolution, and then you became, for want of a better word, radicalized towards the politics, whether you experienced defeat in 1918, 1919 in Germany, and you became radicalized towards far right. So it's really going to be I mean, this is simply going to be a massive sort of voices, a heteroglossia. I mean, we're going to be talking about a lot of different experiences. I can't be going further than that, I'm afraid. Rad, rescue Annette.
I love the laboratory in front of a huge graduate, because what I was going to say is that we cannot underestimate, after the two world wars, the bereavement and the scale of the bereavement, which is so huge. And you can have all kind of diversions about heroism, it's great to die for your country, and so on. You can write it in a paper, and the same night you go home and you cannot stand to have lost your loved one, and you cannot go on. So we have to think about the one who go on in politics, in labor, in everyday life. They are the one who can go over the bereavement, but how many millions cannot and stop living in a way? So they will never know what we call peace, because they will be traumatized and anguished forever. And it's probably why the pacifist movement was so strong between the two wars, and was strong up till inside the Second World War for a very long time, because it was impossible to do it again. And it's true in this country, it's true in every country. It's even true in Nazi Germany, as we know. The Germans changed their mind only after the French defeat in 1940, but till the French defeat, they were not, I mean, the government obviously, but not the German people. So I think we really have to take that as the big defeat of the two world wars. It is a number of dead, of crippled, and of survivors of any kind who could not ever go back to their real life.
Yeah, so I think how memory is conflicting and how the war, I think about post-war rather than interwar, but I think there is almost an obsession, at least in the case of Japan, to find a silver lining because of Hiroshima. There's a silver line that really did something good must come out of it. And I think there's a lot of individual psychology that also comes into it, and at least how bereavement is thought of and mourning is thought about in the middle 20th century, like how do you deal with those things? And at least in Japan, there is this idea that, at least in Hiroshima, that something good must come out of it. And of course, it got to do with occupation and the fact that Americans are controlling the narrative and the making of Japan into a nation of peace. But you can see similar things happening in Germany also. But at the same time, again, memory, I don't know, I think maybe heritage making is a better word than memory making, because heritage, I was looking for the quote before, I don't know if we got it up. So heritage, and this David Leventhal, heritage is not history. I would say also memory is not history. David Leventhal it rises in a time of strife and connects us with the past to comfort us. It's about comfort a lot of times. So a lot of time, even individual memories kind of bring themselves into this kind of genre. And I think a lot about witnessing here. So Lydia Walker and a lot of people talk about witnessing and how people remember things, they put them into those collective genre that tells a story with a good ending. So not always, but so Zionist witness will always end up with going to Palestine. People in America, we came to America and then we rebuild our life. Or Hibakusha, survivors of Hiroshima. Their story will always end with like, and now I'm working for peace. So memory in times of conflict, and of course it's Cold War and everything, in a way serves as comfort even for the survivor themselves, because it gives meaning to the tragedy. So there is working both in individual level, also in communal level here.
You're still muted. Classic problem.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
Thanks. Yeah, just 2 points. One, I think that, the whole kind of division between war and peace, I wonder whether an alternative way of thinking of it is different degrees of use of force. And sorry, I still can't see anyone. I'm just, you can, okay. So because, even kind of Clausewitz in kind of on war, he talks about war as a continuation of political intercourse through other means. And I think that can be employed to a colonial context. And earlier we spoke about, sorry, I'm just trying to, sorry, I don't think I'll be able to see you anymore. We spoke about kind of feminist history, and I'll just give you 2 examples of how different experiences can be. One is I had kind of interviewed a person whose grandfather was in the First World War, and he said that how his grandmother kind of went completely mad with grief. This is the First World War, and their house was known as the asylum. And in India, the pacifist responses are often through songs of women, of non-literate women. I'll give you a counter example, and this is a fictional character from Pat Barker's Regeneration, where this working class woman says, "For me, peace started in August 1914, because I used to be beaten up by my husband, and now he's off to war, and I'll now get myself a new pair of teeth and go dancing every night." And there is that history as well, I think. So I think when we talk of peace and war, they are quite specific also.
Yeah, just on this point, Santanu, I should mention my friend and colleague Bella Bodo, who's written a great book, about these Hungarian women who poisoned their husbands. This was a huge scandal, of course it would be, murdered their husbands. They've been away fighting on the Eastern Front. They've been in Russian captivity. So they didn't get back to Hungary until sort of 1921, 1922. And when they did, the women poisoned them when they came back. They weren't. It's like the anti-Odyssey, right? So I mean, there's a serious point here, and it speaks to the one that you're making, a feminist point, in fact, that the reality of married life for these women was so miserable and so close to enslavement that the prospects as their husbands coming home, it's exactly like your working class woman from Regeneration, that she's liberated when her husband leaves for the front. When their husbands came back from the front after all these years, relatively unexpectedly in many cases, this was the beginning actually of a new period of misery. So I mean, I guess the bigger point is that individual perspectives on war can be, in fact, completely counterintuitive if you run them down feminist lines or subaltern lines as well.
A couple more comments. Yes.
I just add something from. I just had something from Belgium, where exactly the contrary happens. A man comes from war, and he thinks his wife cheated on him, and so he kills her, and immediately he's freed. He's a hero because he comes from war, and the woman on the home front has been betraying. So in memory, the gender issue is still very, very important. And so you have to put all this together to see how complicated it is again.
Yeah, like literally the home front, the war continued inside the homes with a lot of men coming back being traumatized and not giving any and abusing their families. I mean, the domestic violence inside the home continue for in every society. It's a huge problem. And so the war continued literally in the home. So it's a very different home front. So the war on women continue inside the homes later on. So a feminist, as it started, John Paul, a feminist will completely change the periodization here, I think. But maybe we should.
Yeah. So, oh, Santanu, did you wave?
Just a quick point. Again, another example, literary, is Lady Chatterley, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley, who is supposed to have sex with a man who has come back in pieces. And this was the condition of millions of women. You know, we are full of sympathy, as we should be, with the mutilated kind of war hero. But when they come to bed, when they it's a Freudian slip, when they come home and these women are forced. So there is that history as well. I think that's one part where new work is appearing, but maybe not enough. Like, where does violence go when the men come back home?
And just to underscore that in the contemporary context, there's a great book by Kathleen Bilu called Bring the War Home, about American GIs coming back, and they're the antecedents of white nationalism as we know it today, and their militarization and mobilization is very much part and parcel of the kinds of separatist white nationalist groups that we know of as, you know, being deeply problematic, like the Oath Keepers and January 6th insurgents. So where does that violence go in the home, and how is that channeled towards future generations is another topic we've been talking about. White nationalist women are huge in that movement, and a sort of mythological vision of what that home looks like, which often was full of domestic abuse and other things that we're already characterizing. So we need to open this up for more from you all. And the first question, exuberantly expressed earlier, please toss it at us.
Apparently I'm so loud. Yeah, I'm sorry about jumping the gun. I missed the whole hybrid year, and so I still think in 3 dimensions, and I didn't realize you were talking to the camera. So okay, so I want to ask a question I picked up on, I think, Annette and Ron in particular, sort of the relationship between memory and personal experience. And I think Annette's comment will stay with me forever about the using suitcases and shoes and how things become iconic and become sort of packaged as the proper memory of any particular event. And I'm thinking of personal experiences. And it is interesting that the same thing often happens with personal experiences. And I'll give you a concrete example. So I've been working a lot on the history of bombing. And it's very interesting that whatever the case is, Hiroshima, Tokyo, Hamburg, that you start to get the same accounts where every historian then feels obligated to put this part in on personal experiences, and the personal experiences all seem to be the same. People suffered, and it stops at that. And I find it interesting because personal experiences, as we've all said, are very complicated. One of the things I think is really interesting is survival strategies among people who were bombed or about to be bombed. And I'm thinking of, just I'll give you one example, but there's something called trekking in England. Sue knows all about it. It happens a little bit in the First World War in places like Hull, but then it happens a lot in the Second World War, particularly port cities get bombed again and again. And so everybody knows the Germans are going to bomb at night. So as a survival strategy, you start to get thousands and thousands of people on a daily basis who will trek out into the countryside at night so they won't get bombed. It's extremely disruptive to their lives. And I found exactly the same thing happens in Japan, particularly in the smaller cities where it's easier to get out to the countryside. And so these sort of experiences, they don't get captured, and I haven't seen any serious work on trekking in England, and I suspect part of it is because it doesn't fit a good memory, because the British are supposed to stand up, they're supposed to be defiant, they're supposed to be resilient, they're not supposed to be running away. And so I just wonder, all these, we capture so few experiences because we think we know the right answer, how people are supposed to behave. So I just wonder if anybody want to comment on that.
Thank you.
Sure. Can I just share a quick, I don't need the microphone, I'm pretty damn loud. No, it's
So people see it. So anyway, this really strikes a chord with me. This is my 6th history class. Me and Don are Vietnam. That was our war. But My grandmother, born and raised in Antwerp, Belgium, would tell you that World War I ended in September of 1939. And I know there's been a question or two, when does one war stop? One war, that's what Bonica would tell you. My mother, born and partially or raised till her 20s in Antwerp, Belgium. And my father spent 3.5 years in Europe and had come across on day 2 or 3 into Normandy. The reason I mentioned my dad, and there was some comments about Russia, and we were talking with Professor Mansour over here about Russia currently, and the only point I make is my dad met up with the Russians in Leipzig and has no use for the Russians compared to the Germans. And part of that with the Germans is my grandmother owned a cafe, or in our terms here, a bar in Antwerp. And when the Germans came through, she catered to the German army. And when the Americans came through, she catered to the US Army. And therefore, I'm sitting here because my dad met my mother in Antwerp, and she was a war bride. And I am Don and I are first generation after World War II babies. So just a personal comment.
Okay. All right. So tackling the personal, the suffering, the trekking. Just dive in for now. We'll get the next. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I don't know, but like Vietnam actually is a really good example. There's a lot of work on veterans coming back from Vietnam and doing those circles to talk about trauma. It's actually where I do a PhD, came from work on Vietnam veterans. And there's a lot of work on how Vietnam veterans a lot of times believe they had the right Vietnam experience. Well, in reality, they actually watch Vietnam War films. Because we tend as individuals to confirm, and this is how we remember our even day-to-day life, right? I mean, broke up with our girlfriend, but we had a scene from film in our head. This idea of how individual memory work and how dialectic with communal memory, and how we as individuals believe certain ideas and certain kind of what's a proper war experience, specifically war. I mean, I remember I was in the military, and we don't have any. We behaved even as we were fighting an actual war. We behaved like we're in a war film because we don't have any models. But like writing peace on our helmets and silly things like this. But it exists in both ways. I think this is what's the word in English? Making it into a generification. Generification, yeah. Of memory.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I'm going to try to phrase this comment in the form of a question, which is about the political uses of war memory. So, Britain, the Blitz spirit, the mobilization of that for all kinds of purposes, as if there wasn't an imperial dimension to this war, right? As if it was only experienced by, in many cases, English people in particular cities, the way that can be redeployed. And I'm just wondering if other people want to comment on how war memory, particularly in the Second World War, has all kinds of interesting and deeply problematic uses that color how we can then put objects in a museum or understand them in some kind of way that doesn't carry that baggage.
And we've got two coming in.
Yeah, I can ask this the first. It kind of goes well with that. So politicized remembering. How is that paired with politicized forgetting? Marta Oppenpiece, our colleague who will be joining us tomorrow, says Annette's comment on oblivion reminds me very much of the buried giant, which brings out how oblivion can function at a state, community, and individual level with its costs and benefits. I'd love to hear more about the willingness to obviate violent experiences.
You mentioned Jeffrey's point. No.
Oh, sure. And Jeffrey Parker also asks, he says, Britons of his generation, so growing up in the 50s and 60s, would have termed the most important event of World War II El Alamein. Virtually no one then would have said Stalingrad, and curiously, few would have answered D-Day, even though far more British troops fought and died in Normandy than in Egypt. Why? Because in the post-war period, Alamein still seemed like a turning point, the turning point. Is this the same for survivors of the wars in other countries? Initially, they remembered and memorialized what had mattered most to them at the time.
Okay, Cam, could you just give us the first question one more time? Could you just quickly pass it?
Yeah, so Martha, so on to Sue's point about how memory can be political, I wanted to add, how can forgetting be political? So how can states, communities, and individuals obviate violent experiences in terms of question?
Yeah, I guess I can jump in. I completely agree with you, Sue. I agree that this is a huge problem in the UK and elsewhere. I don't know what the strategy I mean, there are practicalities to this, aren't there? I mean, there's money and there's patronage and there's, you know, you need money to make a film. Peter Jackson does, or whoever. You know, you need money to put on a huge national exhibition. So there's a practical dimension to this political message where it's, you know, you can trace, you know, you can follow the money and you can trace that this is coming from a political source. I'll say the second part more tentatively, because I don't want to relativize political difference too greatly, but it might be that there's comparisons to be made, that we're talking about a spectrum here, and we're much more likely to think about the political uses of memory in so-called totalitarian states, the Soviet Union and so on, maybe even fascist states. It might be that we yeah, so I don't know, but I made this point rather tentatively, so I wouldn't sort of I wouldn't go all the way. I wouldn't die on a hill at this point. The point about oblivion and memory is a good one. And again, I'm thinking of Czechoslovakia, where in contemporary liberal Czech Republic, in the last 10 or so years, there's been a kind of revival, a memory revival, not so much in historiography, but more in novels, in television shows and in movies about the so-called Ottoman, which is the cleansing of the German population from the borderlands. And there's been a great novel by a Czech author, and there's been a movie a couple of years ago, which is pretty decent as well. So this has sort of been in oblivion for a very long time. This is now circulating back into memory. My thought about this, my question really, it comes back to Shell's point about how it's one thing to talk about political and collective memories, but there is also a personal individual need to come to terms with the past. And it occurs to me that, coming back to this point about oblivion and memory, there are many such memories like this. These sort of Germans who were removed from this territory, there's no way to articulate meaning out of this, and I've met some of these people, and they simply said they didn't talk about it after the war, which is completely understandable. There was no frame of memory on which to hang this, so it's almost like a counterexample to this case of, oh, okay, I had this war experience, but then I watched this movie or I read this book, and that's how I remember my own memories, because they're so they're in such currency and they're so public. Here we're dealing with something completely the opposite, but surely the need to come to terms with the past is still there. So I wonder what happens, and it would be the same, for example, for people who fought in the Habsburg army during the First World War and then came into these new states. They don't have almost any space whatsoever in the public sphere to sort of come to terms with their war memories.
Yeah, I thought the question about El Alamein is really interesting. Because I would say for the next generation, it was El Alamein, then Stalingrad was forgotten. But what it does, the question doesn't say is that the Holocaust was forgotten too. Yeah. And that nowadays, when you think Second World War, most of the people, you think Holocaust before thinking of the military question. I know that in this country in the 50s, the hate against the Japanese was very high, and it was very high in the memory. I have a friend who was a Jewish friend who was studying at Berkeley in the 50s, and she got a Japanese boyfriend, and her parents thought it was the most atrocious thing they could do. They were Jewish, all their family had been exterminated. They were in America, they were safe, but it was the Japanese hate. So their memory was the public memory of Americans, the fact they were Jewish was on the back. Later on, her and her children put the Holocaust first. And I think the politicization is very important in this way, because you are yourself, you have all kinds of things, you are a woman, you are a Jew, you are not a Jew, you are etc., but you belong to a country. And your different memories, intimate and collective, go to your different groups. And at some point, the intimate is totally kept inside. And at other moment, the intimate goes first. But the politicization can be either in the collective or in the intimate. It's not something which is floating around and sometimes stopping or not. It's always there. And that's why it is so complicated to be a human being. And that's why it's so complicated to be historians, because we have to have all this flux all the time in us.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought the Japanese American experience, because this is actually something that I wanted to bring up, and I forgot. So there's a book by Ellen Eisenberg called The First Degree Down Injustice, about the experience of Jews in the West Coast and their relationship to Japanese internment. Here it is. So, and there is a memory in the Jewish memories that the Jews stood up against the internment, but there were some who did, but most Jews were terrified, because we forget, another forgetting, that LA was a Nazi. There's a lot of Nazis in LA, and the Jews were afraid that it will come after them, so they were kind of happy that people went after the Japanese. It really complicated the relationship between and here you have very particular, oblivion of both of those experiences, because then afterwards the Japanese Americans also forgot this, and now my daughter reads books about how Japanese Americans and Jews stood hand in hand and made all those manga comics books about how Japanese and Jewish Americans stood hand in hand with African Americans, and also the sort of the same of Jewish memory of civil rights, how supposedly, and there were rabbis that went down, but they forget that Jews in the South also didn't really want to stand up for African Americans, again, because they didn't want people to come after them. So it's very complicated, and you have those, and it's not always come from any kind of, it's a lot come from survival, that's what I want to say. That communities really obliviate those memories in order to, obliviate memories because they're uncomfortable, because war is giving you uncomfortable choices. I guess. I don't know what to say about this 2 point, but yeah, but I'll let Santanu go. Yeah.
Yes, I can't agree more with you, Annette, and I think I myself am an example. I went to an English medium school in India, read English-French poetry of the First World War. I came to Cambridge, and my first 2 books, they're about British literature and culture of the First World War. No mention of Indians at all, to the extent that the novelist Amitabh Ghosh wrote to me saying that, it's fine, I enjoyed, but why do you never mention Indians in the First World War? And I just didn't have the confidence at that time. And it took me another 10 years to write the India thing. So that's one thing. And to come back to Sue's point about the politicization of memory, I think now it is across Europe, it is now tied to an agenda of multiculturalism, which is the whole imperial dimension, which is well-intentioned, but I think it leads to a sanitization of both war and empire. And I think what we forget is that diversity is not decolonization. We just need to look at the current British cabinet. It's the most ethnically diverse cabinet. It's the most right-wing cabinet. So I think we need to bear that in mind as well.
That's a great place, unfortunately, for us to have to end. But the intersection that I hope we've come out of here is the global home fronts and imperial histories being so deeply implicated in memories of war, and how hard it is for historians to track that down. As intellectual historians often say, it's like nailing jelly to a wall, right? It's always a moving target dripping down. And yet all these new directions are really essential to understanding the wars in their global impact and global context. I can't help but think, apropos of Santanu's point, that the progressive intellectuals that I've studied in the US in the World War I context, they were co-opted by the state. As Randolph Warren famously said, war is the health of the state, and talk about politicization. And they bought into the Wilsonian mission. And then part of the forgetting of the 20s, part of the forgetting of the 20s that was multiculturalism, the first cultural gifts movement, was in fact a turn against that homogenizing melting pot that they realized was deeply problematic in the World War I context, where it became xenophobia, and of course intersected with the xenophobia of the 20s that led to the rise of the Klan and all kinds of terrible things in the US context. And so, the politicization of these moments isn't just on the left or the right, as you were noting, right? We often note it as being fascistic, but it is not necessarily that. And so with that uplifting final remark, please help me in thanking these fantastic panelists.